Prologue. The message from the division head flickered on Alain's holographic display, and his stomach churned with a sinking feeling. He'd been down this road before, the inevitable summons that could only mean trouble. As one of the last engineers with a deep understanding of the archaic systems powering humanity's interstellar fleet, Alain knew his expertise made him valuable, but it didn't make him invincible. The higher-ups had been breathing down his neck for weeks, and he suspected this meeting would be the final showdown. Alain navigated the gleaming corridors of the station, his mind racing through the possible scenarios awaiting him behind the division head's door. The sleek, modern aesthetic of the station stood in stark contrast to the aging ships he maintained, their outdated technology a testament to a bygone era. As he approached the office, Alain steeled himself for the confrontation to come, knowing that his knowledge might be the only thing standing between humanity and the unforgiving void of space. He stared at the models of famous or specialized ships in a glass case when the secretary looked up from behind her screens. "Mr. Rains can see you now," she said and gestured at the door. "Here we go," he thought as he stood up. "Have a seat. It's come to our attention that blah, blah, blah. We had a talk with blah and blah, and to our regret, we had to decide to let you go since it seems our working environment is too restricting for you. We hope you will find a more satisfying position elsewhere." He grabbed the door handle and pushed it down. "Yeah, that'll be it. Goodbye and good luck." The older chap in gray suit behind a neat desk gestured at the chair in front. "Glad you could come. Have a seat," he said with a warm smile that raised Alain's suspicions. Alain sat down while casually glancing at bits and pieces of various disassembled systems decorating the office. Alain knew Rains had less knowledge of hydraulic valves and electric switches than his own late grandmother, but it probably served the purpose of impressing guests, the higher-ups, and the new guys who had no clue about him yet. Rains leaned forward on his elbows. "It has come to our attention that you're the most resourceful engineer we have here." Alain kept a straight face while mentally rolling his eyes. "Knew it. At least he starts with the compliment. We had a talk with your manager, and he thinks you're not getting the job satisfaction that suits someone with your capabilities. Just say honestly and directly that you're kicking me out so we can get on with whatever we have to do next," Alain thought. Rains leaned a little back, "Which is why we'd like you to carry out a special assignment that has been requested by the government." Alain's train of thought hit the brakes and sparks rained from the wheels. "A what?" Rains stared directly at the man with his unfaltering smile. "How does being in charge of disassembling a warship in space sound?" The train derailed. "You're transferring me?" Chapter 1. The vast expanse of space stretched out before Alain as he guided his crew pod towards the imposing warship Walkyria. The pod, a tiny speck against the colossal vessel, would be his sanctuary and prison for the months to come. As he maneuvered the pod into position above one of the service hatches, Alain couldn't shake the feeling that this mission would be unlike any he'd undertaken before. With practiced precision, Alain double-checked the video feed, ensuring the pod was perfectly aligned with the hull below. The harpoons fired with a satisfying thunk, the lines pulling taut as the pod reeled itself in. The metallic clunk of the pod settling onto the Walkyria's surface reverberated through the small space, a reminder of the thin barrier separating him from the unforgiving void. Alain's fingers danced across the piloting console, verifying the tension on each cable before activating the artificial gravity floor. As the familiar weight settled upon him, Alain took a deep breath, steeling himself for the challenges that lay ahead on this enigmatic warship. He unbuckled and took a few steps to stretch his legs after the long, weightless journey to the crash site of the Walkyria with the Sylph warship Amaroth. He peeked through one of the windows towards the front of the ship where the two ships had collided. The force of the impact had fused the two ships together through melted parts of the structure, and they were virtually inseparable since. Movement on the hull of the Amaroth told him the Sylph were settling in on their warship. Two suits moved around their crew pod in what he expected their first inspection of their connection to the ship. After the Sylph and Earth agreed on a tentative ceasefire, the negotiations began on what to do with the combined wreckage. Both parties showed their distrust by accusing each other of spying if one or the other began recovery unless they were present. Neither wanted to have the other side use a large crew where one member could slip away unnoticed and sneak aboard the other's vessel, or attempt an attack on the other crew and take over the whole wreckage. Keeping an eye on everything by placing other warships close to it was undesired by the politicians, as it could cause more tension and create a chance of escalating things at the slightest accident. In the end, it was agreed to send a two-man crew, each with strict orders forbidding boarding the other warship while recovering requested parts from the ships. Sensors would set off an alert to both parties if that happened. And now I'm here on my own to do the job, Alon thought as he retrieved his suit to inspect his landing site. Outside, he attached the two lifelines from his suit to the safety rungs of the hull. These long rungs ran in every direction to prevent personnel drifting away from the ship while they were doing maintenance or any other task requiring them to be outside. Although the military officially forbade it, crews engaged in competitions now and then to see who could traverse a course laid out on the hull the fastest. The ones with the biggest death wish and need for attention did it without using the safety lines. The ones who were recovered after drifting away from the hull were transferred permanently to a planet-based and extremely boring environment. Alan gazed along the shaded long hull of the Walküre from the aft section and the bulky structures used to house the various fighters and transport shuttles to the wreck bow, and along the angled long hull of the Amaroth, with similar structures housing their fighters in the launch and landing bays. The smaller structures were rows of missile launchers, Gauss guns, and laser turrets. So much destructive force, he thought, and looked out at the stars and the one visible orange-red planet in a wider orbit in the solar system. So much empty space, yet still two stubborn mules of captains had to cross paths here and compete in the size of their balls in a game of chicken behind the wheel of fucktons of metal. He sighed. Different species, same stupidities. He went around his pod and pulled on each anchor cable to feel the tension and examine the penetration of each harpoon. The hull didn't show signs of imminent rupture at each impact point, and he continued on to the service hatch a little further away. The numeric access panel was lit, which told him there was at least partial power in this section. When the surviving crew left the warship, almost everything was powered down to prevent fires or worse, because the infrastructure received a system-wide surge at the impact and blew up various components. He typed in the access code he had to learn by heart, and which provided access to all parts of the ship. That root code provided even access to systems and sections that even the captain's code wouldn't, and Alan imagined working on the ship and smirking internally every time the officers came by and pretended they had more control than the lowly engineer, keeping the ship running. Who's really in control, he thought when the panel lit up green and he pulled open the hatch. Emergency light strips lit up the ladder going down. "Welcome aboard," he said to himself and descended into the airlock. More emergency lights switched on in the corridor below and gave him a dim view of his surroundings. It reminded him of scenes of sunken submarines, only without creatures of the sea swimming around and crawling in and out of various drowned sailors' orifices. He found a terminal console nearby, opened it, activated the local power circuit, and activated the gravity floor with the override button when the circuit lit up green. He held onto the console while his body was drawn slowly to the floor and let go when his weight rested securely on his feet. A test run of all systems returned a positive result, and he activated the environmental control, then took off his helmet when that lit up green. He took a deep breath of the cold filtered air and was glad ships like these carried a greenery to filter the smell of humans from the air, and planned to see if he could hook up the pod's filtration system to the ship and get rid of his own smell building up in the pod. A cursory exploration of the section revealed it was a standard mixed section containing crew quarters, local mess hall, storage of goods and weapons, and independent support infrastructure. Medium and larger ships had been sectioned into independent parts for redundancy and survival in case of incidents, and in cases of military vessels, battles. The fighting between humans and Sylph had proved the efficiency of the design. The weapons storage had been cleared of weapons and ammunition during the disembarking of the crew, and Alam was a little disappointed when he looked at the empty racks. He'd been assigned a pistol as an emergency weapon if the Sylph did decide to compromise the Walküre, or worse, targeted him, but if it did end up like that, He'd like to have something a bit more intimidating to wave around, even if he had no intention to actually use it. The little disappointment at that left quickly when he took a peek inside the mess hall stores and the amount of food left there. The status report he'd been given on the ship stated the cargo sections had been mostly emptied and thus of the main food supply as well, but it looked like they hadn't bothered to empty the well-stocked section storages. He took out an oblong container from one of the compartments labeled ravioli and smiled a little. He wouldn't have to worry about food in the first place because his pod was stocked up for 2 people, and the probes sent to retrieve the recovered parts would deliver supplies as well. But if a probe failed or arrived empty, it wouldn't matter, especially when he noticed the drinks cabinets and the amount of alcohol in it. Top brass had found out quickly that morale went down into the dumps if the military crew was forbidden to drink during their stay in space, while civilian crews could, and had allowed a limited amount of alcohol to be used on journeys. Now he wouldn't have to worry about food or getting wasted if he desired to. He returned to the pod with a real book he spotted in the corner of one of the crew quarters. Items like that were rare in space, and it happened to be one he hadn't read from one horror writer he knew. He could end the day after writing the initial report with a good meal and a good book, and accompanied by a stiff drink. Alan woke up and stretched as far as he was able to in the cramped space he slept in. He contemplated moving to one of the crew quarters, but with the state the ship was in, he didn't want to risk something going wrong while he slept, and at worst locking him inside without access to food or water, or at best killing him quickly through asphyxiation. He freshened up in the tight shower and picked something to eat at random while he went over the list of requested parts for recovery and sending back with the first probe that would arrive in 50 days. The initial list was made for 2 people to work on, and he decided to take his time locating and disassembling the parts. He was confident he could do more than half on his own if there were no unforeseen circumstances, but he wouldn't reveal that to his supervisors. He'd take full advantage of the fact he was sent alone and make clear things would then take more than double the effort compared to 2 men handling them. He would enjoy his time away from home and work at a leisurely pace. He pulled up a schematic of the ship with the location of the parts, beginning at the front of the ship, which could be the easiest target for the Sylph to try and retrieve. The crews that went over the wreckage to retrieve the dead had reported they could see and enter the Sylph ship through breaches in both hulls. After finishing his meal, he dressed up in his environmental suit, went over the checklist to ensure it was in perfect working condition, and took the toolbox from its locker and headed out for his first day of work on the Walcurea. He used his security lines to follow one set of long rungs leading to the front of the ship. At a safe distance from the impact, he used another service hatch to enter the ship, and the section systems check showed most were damaged and unusable. He drifted his way through the damaged and slightly warped corridors by the light of the suit's torches until he ended up at the very front in the sight of space through cracks and twisted walls. Through them, he looked into the similar twisted and torn structure of the Sylph ship. He couldn't imagine what had gone through the people who were there at the time of the collision. His light shone on a fuzzy piece of thick cable, but when he looked closer, he recognized it as the severed thin tail of a Sylph. He averted his eyes quickly and looked at the identification numbers painted on the walls. One of the weapon controller circuits he was supposed to retrieve should be somewhere close by, and he focused on the search. After the retrieval of the broken second item on his list, Alam went into another section and found himself at a slightly warped door behind which would be the next item. A quick examination of the door made him think he might still get it open, and he hooked up the portable power source from his toolbox to the door motor. IT hummed as it tried to turn, and Alam pried a crowbar into the gap between the wall and the door. With a few firm jerks by placing his feet against the edge of the wall and the force of the motor, the door slid open until it stuck again. The opening was large enough for Alan to get through that row, and he unhooked the power from the door motor. As he stepped inside, he faced a tangled mess of half-melted steel beams and ragged edges of plating with enough holes to see directly into the interior of the Sylph ship and the Sylph disassembling circuits behind a panel there under the light of its suit. The Sylph suit turned his way partially. Alan dimmed the torches of his suit and put up his hand in greeting while his heart beat faster in nervousness. "No hostile intentions here," he said, even though the Sylph could not hear him. "We're all just colleagues doing the same job." The Sylph didn't move, and Alan turned to the side where he expected to find the panel and circuits he was looking for. He started working as casual as he could on removing the panel and noticed the Sylph had continued with his work. He figured the Sylph must have had the same thoughts and wasn't surprised to see a human working on the most vulnerable pieces of equipment to be a target of espionage. One of the humans just entered the interior on the other side, said Asitha as she turned to see the source of the sudden light. Hostile? Asked Tynes, clutching the screwdriver she held. Asitha watched the human put up his hand, pause for a moment, and then move on. Doesn't look like it. I think he just gave me a human greeting, and now it looks like he's going to work on the same thing we're here for. Tynes felt a slight nervousness. It's a male? I don't know. I can't see the face in the first place, and even then, when they're shaved, it's sometimes hard to tell if they're male or female. Ah, true. I'm almost done here anyway, so it doesn't matter. Alain noticed the Sylph storing several boards into a sack and leave the compartment at the other side. All right, see you tomorrow, he said. Say hello to the wife and kids for me. He pried open the floor panel. Good to know there's someone to talk to way out here. Several days had passed and Alan checked the list of parts he had recovered with the order list. He hummed in satisfaction when he was ahead of his personal schedule. Time for some exploration, he said to himself and pulled up the ship's schematics. He studied them for a while, then put on his suit and exited the pod with his tools. He found the cables he needed in a section next to the one underneath his pod and went to work on removing access panels from the hull close to the pod. What's he doing? Asked Asitha while she brushed her red fur before going to sleep. Tynes zoomed in on the human poking around and connecting cables to the Walkyria. I'm not sure. Maybe he's repairing a circuit. Asitha put her brush away and dumped her empty meal wrapper in the trash can. There's still no second human? Do you suppose he's here all alone? He can't be. They were supposed to send 2 people just like agreed in the terms of the recovery agreement. The other one must be working on the ship or still be inside the pod. Tynes turned back to her friend. But shouldn't we have seen at least a glimpse of both of them together by now? Asitha frowned at Tynes. We still have to assume there's 2 of them. Maybe they work in shifts, or what could be possible a breach of trust. One of them is trying to gain access to the Amaroth in secret. Tynes's eyes went wide and her thick white fur tingled as her skin crawled at the thought. You think so? Asitha leaned back. I doubt it somehow, but we'd better do a perimeter check at our next shift to see if all the proximity sensors work as intended. Tynes nodded and continued observing the human on the Walkyria. She didn't really like the idea of a human male going around their territory. Alain pulled gently on each cable to make sure they were connected securely to the ship's circuits and the adapters, and the connections of the pod's external access. Satisfied with his work, he entered the pod again, pulled up the pod's systems on his command tablet, and poured himself a drink. Gain physical access, hack everything, he said, and began typing commands into separate terminal windows. Asitha and Tynes jumped up from their sleep at the light shock going through their crew pod. What's that? Asked Tynes as she scrambled to the pod's controls to see if there was an emergency warning. Asitha went from window to window to look for signs of an explosion or impact. She froze when she saw lights burning across most of the Walkyria. They've activated the ship! Tynes rushed towards another window and stared with increasing nervousness at the activity of the human warship. What's going on? Alain chuckled at the output, scrolling at one of the terminal windows. If anyone thought I'd be manually checking each and every section on the ship, they're fucking nuts, he said and took a gulp from his drink, then typed in the next command. Asitha and Tynes watched in horror when weapon bay doors opened and laser turrets went through their full range of motion. Tynes jerked away from the window. They're going to attack us. Asitha gripped the edge of the window with her claws. That makes no sense. The ship should have no ammunition. It should have all been taken away during the rescue of the crews. We have to call for help. Wait, said Asitha when all turrets returned to their parking positions and the weapon bay doors closed again. The lights from inside the ship turned off one by one and the whole thing went dead again. She looked back at Tynes. I think they were running a test. Test, she said and looked out the window again. If they really planned on attacking us, they would have done it earlier, Asitha said and turned away from the window. There would be no benefit to it anyway, since it would just trigger another conflict. It also explains why they were connecting their pod to the ship. Tynes nodded and relaxed a little. They were just testing everything. Asitha went to her seat and sat down to get her weight off of her trembling legs. Those plunging Shymaks scared the shaz out of us with their stunt. Tynes sat down in her seat. Yeah, she said inside. Couldn't we do the same? Asitha shook her head. Unless you know a way, all I could do is connect cables to what might be the right ports, but that's all. I don't have the knowledge on the network core. Tynes looked over her shoulder towards the Walkyria. They're a big step ahead of us now. Alain looked over the filtered list of faulty equipment and wrote up lists of where to prioritize retrieval of components, physically check power sources, and the contents of mess hall storages. He also made a list of the greenery locations to see if it was possible to revive them and enjoy probably the most fresh air any human could breathe without the need to set foot on foreign territory. He looked out of the window next to him towards the Sylph pod, wondering if Sylph enjoyed being outside in nature more than humans. Tynes pulled a warp panel from a wall at another impacted compartment. She couldn't stop thinking how creepy the scene around her was and feared something might give way and trap her for the few hours she could survive in her suit. Flashes of light startled her, and she would have jumped up at the ceiling if her magnetized boots hadn't gripped the floor. The human, she thought while her fur pricked up at once. Alain put up his hand in greeting again. Hey, how's it going? He said. The coffee any good here? With no reaction as expected, he went on with his own work. Tynes watched him move over to the side and busy himself with removing debris in one corner. The human's here, she said. Did he do anything? Asked Asitha over the radio. No, just greeted me like he did you, I think. Then we probably don't have to worry about them coming after us. They kept quiet these last days. Tynes took a deep breath. It must have been a test then. I won't exclude other options, but it seems most likely. Just keep an eye on him while he's there. Tynes looked at the human digging into the debris and scattering bits and pieces of broken and twisted metal and braced himself to pull on something. I will. Shit, Alain said as he jerked on his crowbar to rip a panel from its hinges. Come off already! He took a better stance against the wall and pulled with all the strength he could muster. He could have written off the item behind the panel from the list, but for some reason he felt like taking on the challenge of retrieving it. He exhaled, took a deep breath, and gave the crowbar another fierce jerk. The hinges broke apart, and he shot back, realizing he hadn't activated his boots to clamp to the wall. His back hit his open toolbox, and the contents burst out all over the place. Fuck, he said, and scrambled to catch the tools floating away towards the impact breaches. Tynes flinched at the sudden violent changes in light from where the human was. For a moment, she thought he had a seizure, or his suit had ripped, but then she saw him swimming frantically like a kitten for the first time in water after tools drifting from his toolbox. She watched as he tried to grab a screwdriver and only hit it into turning on its axis, or grab spanners and pliers and try to send them back towards the spinning and spilling toolbox. The way he desperately flung his arms around to steer his way around and try to collect his tools made her laugh. What's going on? Asked Asitha, who stopped mid-work at hearing the sudden outburst of laughter over the radio. Tynes giggled. The human somehow spilled all his tools all over the place and is trashing like a fighting kitten to collect them. Alain watched in frustration when several tools drifted through the breaches into the Sylph side. He reached out for them, but he only tapped one of them away. Shit, he sighed. Tynes saw the human hang on to the wreckage and felt sorry for him. Even though thinking logically, they'd had to have enough spare tools and they weren't a big loss, but she understood what it was like to have to lose even little things. She sighed, put down her own tools, and went over to the other side of the compartment to collect the human's belongings. Alain feared the Sylph was confiscating his tools, but watched in surprise when he moved up to him next and held them out to him at the breach. He hesitated for a moment, then took them in his hands. Thank you. They stared at each other through their dark faceplates, and Tynes pushed back to get back to work, when the human quickly held up his hand again. He touched controls below his helmet, and a light turned on inside his helmet, lighting up his face. The human gave her a smile and bowed his head, then mouthed two words. Her heart beat faster at the first time seeing a human's face for real up close. She hadn't expected to see any of them so close, even though she knew she'd be working a job where they were near. She was pretty certain he was a male because she could see light hair growth around his chin, and his light-colored eyes and expression projected a friendly nature. He turned his helmet light off again, and it looked like he'd returned back to his work, and Tynes put up her hand to stop him before she realized she did so herself. She swallowed and took a deep breath. She'd been taught humans were horrible creatures and they shouldn't be given any advantage, but something deep inside her told her this human wasn't the bad kind. Alam watched the sylph turned on its interior helmet light, and he held his breath at the white feline face looking at him with clear blue eyes. They really resemble felines, he thought as he noticed the sylph's round pupils contracting to vertical slits from the light. The sylph returned a shy smile and looked away before turning the light off. He wasn't surprised at the urge to pet the sylph, since he'd always felt that way at the sight of animals, and chuckled. Would that constitute an interplanetary incident if I did that if we'd ever really met face to face? He thought. He held up his hand again and pushed back to begin gathering the rest of his tools. Tynes returned to her work, giggling at the nervous sensation of making contact with a human lingering in her body. What's the human doing now? Asked Asitha. Tynes looked at the other side. He's collecting his tools after I returned the ones that drifted over to our side. Wait, you did what? Tynes giggled at the sight of the human trying to catch the rest of his tools. He looked kind of helpless when he couldn't get to them. You should have left him be. Who cares about them losing a few tools? Tynes sighed. I know, but I couldn't help it after how he tried to chase them. I've seen kittens more successful at their first hunting game. Asitha chortled. Right, she said. Finish your job. It's time to exchange air. Tynes returned her focus to the control box she had to recover. Yeah. Alain was glad to see he could easily disassemble the sensor array control circuit after spending all that time on returning the tools back to their correct place in his toolbox. He figured he'd had enough excitement and called it a day and returned to the pod. As he exited the service hatch near the front of the ship, he saw the two sylphs standing on the hull of the Amarant. He put up his arm and waved when it looked like they could see him, and was happy to see one of them wave back a little. Who knows? Maybe I just made a friend of an enemy, he thought, and pulled himself along the rungs towards his pod. And here I thought you didn't dare to make contact with males, and now you're waving back at a human one, said Asitha. Tynes giggled. I know it's weird, but maybe it's because there's a safe barrier between us. Asitha hummed. Maybe. I still don't trust him though, even at a distance. It's not like he can do anything on his own. If he's truly alone, and did you forget he activated the whole ship without a minimal crew available? Tynes nodded. There was still that fearsome ability he had shown. Asitha and Tynes found the human working outside the hull at an antenna array near the impact zone, while they were on their way to their work as usual. He greeted them with a wave and Tynes waved back. What's he up to this time? Said Asitha. Alain noticed the sylph gazing at him and suspected they were wondering what he was doing. He pulled himself along the hull towards them and hung on to a protruding beam. He gestured at the length of the two ships, drew a large circle and pointed outwards, then made a fist and hit his open hand. Impact radar, he said. A shield or something? Asked Tynes. No, I think he means to activate the detection of incoming objects, said Asitha. We only have a short-range detection system on the pod and can't detect anything from the other side of the ships. She chuckled. Seems the human has an actual useful idea. So what are we going to do? I don't have the skill to connect and set up the sensors of the Amarant, so we'll have to rely on the human's goodwill and need to be thankful. The sylph bowed a little and Alain was glad to see they understood. He wasn't sure, but it might be that they were glad to see him working on it. It wouldn't surprise him if their pod was as limited in its functionality and safety as his. He held up his hand once and returned to the array. When the sylph passed by, again much later, he noticed both of them returned his greeting.